I never heard anything from Jeff or Amy. Now, I don't have Jeff's number this time. I did have it last time, but he didn't confirm the number, so I didn't want to ring in case it was somebody else. I did phone Amy and I left a message, but I never heard back. I heard that she might have gone back to Texas because her children were diagnosed with having swine flu, or something like that. So she possibly made a mad dash elsewhere. So as arranged, now Ben had offered to take me to the station, which was really, really nice of him. He's one of the people who've made my trip quite special, really, by meeting me and you know, taking me places. So he arrived just before 9, as was arranged, and we left for the station. And we took the highway, which meant that, you know, the 10 miles or so to the station from the hotel, which had taken me, at least, you know, 4 or 5 hours to get to, took about 15-20 minutes. So that was fantastic. We arrived there and he couldn't park, so he said, well, you know, I'll let you go here, I won't come in with you, which is fine, because I wasn't expecting him to come in. He was actually on his way to work. My train didn't leave until about 15:15, and his work started at the hour. So I expect he had places to go, really, or should have had places to go. So we said our goodbyes there in Washington's Union Station, which has several concourses which are fantastic. It has a sort of shopping plaza, which I had a brief look around. And I spent most of my time in the main concourse, which is huge. And around the sides of the concourse, right on the top, there are a load of statues. And they look like sort of royalty. So I inquired as to what they were. And the information office told me, she said, you know, when Union Station was built, the statues came as a gift to the US from an old disused Roman bath in Italy. And she said the problem was, of course, these statues were nudes because they were used to being in a bath. Now, if you actually look at the statues, they're quite high up on the wall, so you probably wouldn't notice even if they were nudes. But the Americans added to these statues a shield which happens to go on the floor right in front of their nether regions. So the statues are sort of adapted for posterity, really, to hide their naughty bits. And the next part of the journey was the 23 hours to Chicago from Washington DC. We got on board the Amtrak train, and I spent most of my time in the next cabin along, which was almost made completely of glass, and it was an observation deck. And it had, you know, chairs, and it had tables, and it had benches. There was also 2 cars for eating. There was the snack bar car on the ground floor, and there was the dinner car, which I made a reservation. It was quite expensive, but I thought, you know, I ought to splash out, so I did that. And at 8 o'clock I was called for dinner, and I sat on a table with 2 other people, both Democrats, actually. So we got on famously. One of them was called Marilyn, and she was going to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, so she was getting off at midnight. The other guy was called Jeff, and he was going to a beer festival in somewhere in Colorado, I believe. So he was going all the way to Chicago, and then he was getting a further Amtrak from there. You know, we talked quite a lot. Jeff was quite quiet. Marilyn, well, she could speak for England. Absolutely fantastic woman, absolutely fantastic. I sat down on the steps down to the snack bar, trying to get my adapter to stick into the plug, which was sort of socket, which was at the bottom. It kept falling out, and I was blocking the way, so I sort of got up and I, apologised for that. And they said, there's not enough PowerPoints, are there? And I said, no, not really. So this guy who'd been sitting on the side had obviously heard, and he said, I think I've charged my phone enough. So he pulled his phone out and he let me use the PowerPoint for, I used it for about an hour and a half. So that was very kind of him. And whilst I was doing that, I spoke to a guy who was in fact from Iowa, and he had just spent the last 3 months cycling across the whole US, I think from one side to the other, and he was now on his sort of return trip by train back to Iowa. So it was fantastic to talk to him. He was in his 60s, but he's still extremely active. So he told me how he'd walked this, famous mountain range, which took him, 6 weeks. He took it in 3 stages. Each stage was 6 weeks before having a break at one of the towns. So I asked him what was next, and he said, he didn't know. He said perhaps he'd go to Ireland and cycle round the coast, because that's pretty scenic. And I said, yes, that would be fantastic. Easily within his ability, even at that age. It was in the middle of the night. I'd finished charging my phone, and I decided I'd get back to sleep in my car. When I got there, I found that the 2 women who had sat behind had spread out, and they moved. One of them had moved forward into my place, and so there was nowhere for me to sit, let alone sleep. So I went to the dining car and I got one of the officials and I said, look, I'm not very happy about moving them, but here's my ticket and I really would like to sit in, to sleep in my chair. Because I tried sleeping in the observation lounge and it wasn't going to be good, and I thought, if I don't get a good night's sleep, or at least try and get a good night's sleep, it's going to backlog and make me feel tired in Chicago. So we got to Chicago, and I had not too bad a night, and I sampled the snack bar before we left, and then we were dropped off at Union Station in Chicago, which I don't like. It's a bit like a maze. Most of it's underground. There are sort of shopping plazas, but it's a bit confusing. So anyway, I managed to get myself out of that. And Chicago, early on a Sunday morning, is quite quiet, and it was just very, very peaceful to sort of walk along by the canal edge. The weather started to deteriorate quite quickly. Changes extremely quickly in Chicago, because we're next to what amounts to be an inland ocean. Basically, it's called Lake Michigan because if you can imagine a sort of an oval-shaped ocean inland, Michigan is like a peninsula that goes into that ocean, and it's sat on top of Indiana and Iowa, in exactly the same way that Denmark is sat on top of Germany. Chicago had its own flag, and I shall go through my flags, I think, in a bit. I discovered, I asked people about what everything is symbolic. For example, the Chicago flag is there's horizontal stripes, and they go white, blue, white, blue, white. And in the centre white strip, there's 4 red stars, or 4 blue stars, I think. No, I think they're red. I can't remember what colour the stars are, but anyway, the white strips represent the 3 sides of the city, because of course the 4th side of the city is against the water, so it actually only has 3 sides of the city. The 2 blue strips represent the 2 rivers that come from opposite directions into the city, where they sort of culminate, come together, and then empty into the inland ocean. And the 4 red stars are important events in the history of the city. Hey, it's good game. Hey, did you see what I just did then? Good, isn't it?